Welcome to Philosophy of Action. Today I want to start a sort of sub-series, an amusing philosophical series that's partially meant to highlight the unintended and sometimes ironic consequences of examining your core beliefs and principles. You can call this series the unintended consequences of moral development. To some people this might be offensive, but hey, that's part of the joke. I'll begin with what I think is the easiest and most controversial example. The liberation or emancipation of women. The idea that women and men should be able to do the same jobs and the same things, if they're able to anyway, and are equal in effectively every respect. Now, I'm not here to judge whether this is morally right or wrong. I'm interested in something else. The fact that sometimes certain moral choices and political decisions have obvious consequences that advocates either ignore or underestimate. In the case of women's emancipation, first politically, then economically, something interesting happened. On the one hand, women became legally and socially independent from their husbands. They became recognized as their own persons with their own rights, responsibilities, and agency. But on the labor market side, this also meant that slowly over time the labor supply massively increased, and roughly speaking, you now had far more people competing for the same kinds of jobs. The demand for labor didn't magically double overnight in the same way, and when supply rises faster than demand, basic economics tells you what happens. The price of labor, wages, comes under pressure. At the same time, household structures changed. Where once a single income might have been enough, in many places it slowly became normal and then necessary for both partners to work because of the aforementioned decrease of wages, just to maintain the same standard of living. So what was framed as liberation from dependence on a spouse also became a new kind of dependence on the broader economy and your employer. In a sense then, instead of being subject to the financial whims of your husband or the person you're supposed to love or be with, you're now subject to the whims of the market and your boss. From the husband's perspective, you could say, you gave your wife the freedom to become a servant to someone or something else instead. This was very clearly not the intention. The goal was more freedom, more security, more dignity. But in practice, for a lot of women, it also produced a world where both partners have to work. Both are more economically pressured, and both are more tightly bound to impersonal systems than before. There's another side effect too: dating and relationships. On average, not in every case, but statistically, women tend to be attracted to men with higher status in some sense to themselves. More money, more education, more competence, more strength, or at least one of these. Even taller might be one of those. But today in many countries, women are now more educated on average than men, and often are catching up or surpassing them in income as well. So what happens? When women become more educated, more empowered, and more economically successful, the pool of men who are above them by those personal standards shrinks, which means that almost by definition, fewer men will meet the standards of any particular woman, at least the standards that they find attractive. The result is a strange tension, where women are more independent than ever, more wealthy, more educated, supposedly means to gain their goal, finding a suitable partner and living a suitable life. But many now actually find it harder to find partners because their standards have risen due to that gain in ability, education, and wealth. And at the same time, the number of men who meet these standards hasn't risen at all. In fact, male education to a certain extent is actually going down. And because modern life often still requires two incomes, people remain dependent on these relationships anyway, which adds an additional frustrating layer. Because now that you have become this empowered woman, you find less men attractive, almost by nature. But you're still forced, by the economic conditions of the time, if you want to have a decently sized living area, to live with a partner. But now there's way less partners you find to be personally acceptable. So in a very rough sense, empowerment can also come with a few new forms of dissatisfaction, in the form of loneliness and a mismatch in expectations. Again, this wasn't necessarily the intention. I'd almost venture to say this was the opposite of the intention, but it is a real side effect.